Jack Diamond is one of the world's most eminent architects, but don't dare call him a starchitect. He believes passionately that buildings are the stars, but they should not be gaudy or flashy. They should fit in with their neighbors rather than shocking them. His latest iconic commission is the new Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, Russia, which opened in 2013 and is the first opera house to be built in Russia since the Tsars. It is 5 times larger than the Four Seasons Center for Performing Arts, Toronto, which he also designed. And now he's on his way to St. Petersburg next month at the invitation of director Valery Gergiev to give his opera house its 2-year checkup. But Jack Diamond is more than an incredible architect. He is also a brilliant diarist and painter. For decades, he's been sketching and writing about his work in travels around the world and recently published a book called Sketches. Please welcome treasured Canadian architect and passionate advocate for livable buildings, Jack Diamond.
A good friend of mine who is head of the sick children's hospital in Halifax told me that children from underprivileged families by the age of 3, and I don't have the numbers correct, but it's about roughly this proportion, hear about 300,000 words. And children from privileged backgrounds by the age of 3 hear 3 million. And the effect on the synaptic gap, the development of that child, is profound. So the importance of these books are not just for the children to read, but for the parents to read to the children. Pretty critical. Another indicator is that colleges have found that there's a much higher likelihood of people finishing university, college and university, if there's a dictionary in the house in which they were brought up. So that whole issue about literacy, about the effect on the population, could not be more profound. So that's why I'm really thrilled to be here. Now, obviously, like others, I had a huge difficulty in choosing a book that influenced me. There's so many. It's too hard to make a choice. So I began to think about, well, how was I influenced by books? And they sort of grouped into 3 categories. What I read least is fiction. But fiction is what I'm going to deal with tonight. Second amount that I read for is, in fact, about warfare. And it's not because I'm a warmonger. On the contrary, I think I would be a pacifist if I had to be called that way. It's to figure out what drives people to create such horrors, such aggression. And I suppose because half my family perished in the Holocaust, I want to figure out how could the Holocaust occur then and is occurring now. How does that happen? So there's a whole body of literatures like that in Margaret Macmillan's book, The War That Ended Peace. It's an enormously successful book at making that kind of analysis. And finally, biography. What is it about those people who achieve greatness? What is it about their characters? What insights can you get to finding out about them? But turning to fiction, fiction that I find most influential, I suppose, is that deals with place. Not surprisingly, because I spend my life figuring out how to deal with place, how to improve place. And the first book I came across that did that as a child, reading Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons. It was a book I got lost in. There was a world in which these children inhabited where their parents were their friends. That was odd. That they had power. And I'm not surprised that there are comic books for Superman and for other kinds of beings that have superpowers, because children are not empowered. They feel powerless, they're small, they're directed by others, and therefore the way in which they think about escaping all of that is through a Spider-Man, or a Superman, to give them that kind of a power. And I found that in books, especially for lonely children who are isolated, the whole world that opens up in those books is so extraordinary. So to It's a gift to children to be able to give them that kind of escape, if you like, but also to learn about that. So the fiction that I want to deal with tonight, which is to deal with place, are probably authors you've never heard of. First one's a very remarkable woman by the name of Olive Schreiner. In the 1890s, wrote a book, A Story of an African Farm. This extraordinary woman, who came out as a governess to a small town in the backwoods of the back bush of South Africa, in fact wrote this book when she was about 23. A feminist before there was feminism. An anti-racist before it became an issue. Someone who actually opposed Cecil Rhodes's depredations in what became Rhodesia and now is thankfully no longer called that. In this book in South Africa, in the South African Farm, which I would urge you to read, there's a great deal of pathos. The characters are wonderful, and there's a particular part of the book which doesn't deal with place, but Waldo's letter. It is an extraordinary letter that I think you would be moved by. But South African authors, like their Russian counterparts, excuse me, Lermontov, Turgenev, Chekhov, all of them are passionate about the land. Their connection to the land is so powerful. In South Africa, there is a semi-desert called the Karoo, which to the uninitiated appears to be sterile, hostile. These people saw its beauty in it, and to the degree that counterintuitively, they found it a sustaining environment and became an element of their survival. I think turning adversity into something that is part of your survival is the greatest architectural trick. Excuse me. Just think of the igloo. Ice kills you. It's the worst kind of environment that you can have. And you turn it into the perfect resistance to wind pressure and creates it as, in fact, thank you so much, turns it into an insulator. That's dealing with place in the most extraordinary manner. In fact, architecture without architects is the best of all. If you think about the Adobe house, there's no brick there, there's no stone, it's mud. So you make mud bricks. They have very thick walls with tiny windows in the desert environment. Those thick walls heat up slowly during the day and cool slowly at the night. So they give warmth at the night and cool in the day. Tiny windows, just like your irises, close up in the bright light. There's this extraordinary response, and of course the opposite in humid, hot, wet climates where there's lots of forest and wood. You make very thin stick-like structures up above the ground to avoid the vermin and catch the breeze. So that response to the environment, like the Russians, is so wonderful. So let me read you a small passage by Olive Schreiner, written by this woman at about the age of 23, and it's her first major novel. The others that she wrote was from Woman to Woman and Women in Labor, very interesting books themselves. So her book, the full African moon poured down its light from the blue sky into the wide, lonely plain. The dry, sandy earth with its coating of stunted karoo bushes a few inches high, the low hills that skirted the plain, the milk bushes with their long, finger-like leaves, all were touched by a weird and almost oppressive beauty as they lay in the white light. In one spot only was the solemn monotony of the plain broken. Near the center, a small, solitary kopje. A kopje is a flat-topped hill. A kopje rose. Alone it lay there, a heap of round ironstone piled one upon the other, as over some giant's grave. Here and there a few tufts of grass or small succulent plants had sprung up among the stones. And on the very summit a clump of prickly pears lifted their thorny arms and reflected, as from mirrors, the moonlight on the broad, flashy leaves. At the foot of the kopje lay the homestead, first the stone-walled sheep kraals and African huts. Beyond them the dwelling house, a square red brick building with thatched roof, even on its bare walls, and the wooden ladder that led up to the loft. The moonlight cast a kind of dreamy beauty. That vast land where there is always peace. That land where the soul, gazing long, loses all consciousness of its little self and almost feels its hand on the old mystery of the universal unity that surrounds it. No death, he muttered. There is that which never dies, which abides. It is but the individual that perishes. The whole remains. And in that same theme, much more current, you've probably read and know Coetzee's work. And he too has that connection to the land. You may have read, they are devastating books. I find them really hard to take. The one that's Waiting for the Barbarians, one of the toughest books I've ever read. And The Master of Petersburg, another Coetzee book. So, he knows Foulfontaine best in summer, when it lies flattened under the even, blinding light that pours down from the sky. Yet Foulfontaine has its mysteries too, mysteries that belong not to night and shadow, but to hot afternoons, when mirages dance on the horizon and the very air sings in his ears. Then, when everyone else is dozing, stunted by the heat, he can tiptoe out of the house and climb the hill to the labyrinth of stone wall kraals that belonged in the old days when the sheep in their thousands had to be brought in from the veldt, to be counted or shorn or dipped. The kraal walls are 2 feet thick and higher than his head, and they are made of flat blue-gray stones, every one of them trundled there by donkey cart. He tries to picture the herds of sheep, all of them dead and gone now, that must have sheltered from the sun in the lee of these walls. He tries to picture Foulfontaine as it must have been when the great house and its outbuildings and kraals were still in the process of being built. A sight of patient, ant-like labor year after year. Now the jackals that preyed on the sheep have been exterminated, shot or poisoned, and the kraals without a use are sliding into ruin. The secret and sacred words that binds him to the farm is belong. Out in the veldt by himself, he can breathe the word aloud, I belong to the farm. What he really believes but does not utter, what he keeps to himself for fear that the spell will end, is a different form of the word, I belong to the farm. He tells no one because the word is misunderstood so easily, turned so easily into its inverse, the farm belongs to me. The farm will never belong to him. He will never be more than a visitor. He accepts that. The thought of actually living on Foulfontaine, of calling the great old house his home, of no longer having to ask permission to do what he wants to do, turns him giddy. He thrusts it away. I belong to the farm. That is the furthest he's prepared to go, even in his most secret heart. But in his secret heart he knows that the farm in its way knows too that farm belongs to no one. The farm is greater than any of them. The farm exists from eternity to eternity. When they are all dead, when even the farmhouse has fallen into ruin, like the kraals on the hillside, the farm will still be here. That kind of enduring quality to it all. And finally, I don't know if any of you have read, probably more familiar with Walcott, the poet who's written a great deal in the Caribbean, who has a very rich imagery. Roy Campbell, in the early part of the 20th century, wrote this poem. It's called a poem from called Out of the Flaming Terrapin. And for me, the kind of vivid imagery, the kind of joy in words, just the power and evocative nature of words themselves comes out of this. It's a kind of poetry that's no longer in fashion because it actually rhymes. But I get a great deal of joy out of it. Out of the ark's grim hold, a torrent of splendor rolled. From the hollow, resounding sides, flashing and glittering, came panthers with sparkled hides, and tigers scribbled with flame, and lions in grisly trains cascading their golden manes. They ramped in the morning light, and over their stripes and stars, the sun-shot lightning, quivering bright, rippled in zigzag bars. The wildebeest frisked with the gale on the crags of a hunchback mountain. With his heels in the clouds, he flirted his tail like the jet of a silvery fountain. Frail oribes sailed with their golden-skinned and feathery limbs laid light on the wind, and the springbok bounced and fluttered and flew, hooping their spines on the gaunt karoo. Gay zebras pranced and snorted aloud, with the crackle of hail their hard hoofs pelt, and thunder breaks from the rolling cloud that they raise on the dusty veldt. Oh, hark how the rapids of the Congo are chanting their rolling strains, and the sun-dappled herds are skipping to the song, go kicking up the dust of the great grey plains. Tsesebe, kudu, buffalo bongo, with the fierce wind foaming in their manes.